my paranormal experiences changed my life. I always tell people that it actually is what brought me to understand my Christianity that I found. My uncle, he had had a stroke, and he was bedridden and unable to walk or speak. He was back in a back room that my aunt kept him in where they would take care of him. And she called me one night. It was late at night, and she told me that she was having what she thought was somebody prowling around the house. So I went to her house, and whenever I got to her front door, she said, "Come on in." And of course, I had my weapon with me, and she said, "You're not going to need your weapon with what's here." And I said, "Okay." And whenever I went inside, she had a mirror that was in the hallway. This mirror was reflecting into her front room onto the wall, and she told me to sit down and watch inside of the reflection. So I was sitting there and I was watching, and I wasn't a real big believer in ghosts at the time or anything like that. And I noticed that in the reflection, there appeared to be kind of looked like the shadow of a finger that would poke out. And I thought, well, it's got to be the newspaper, or, the phone book that was hanging on the wall, and the fan was blowing it, and it was causing probably to make the shadow, and it spooked her. Well, I got up and I moved it, sat back down, and it continued to do it. And she had already believed and probably had seen more than I had before I got there, but she told me that what I was seeing was a nose. So, still not believing, I got up and thought that something was probably reflecting from outside. And I went and I closed the blinds. And whenever I closed the blinds, it still continued to do it. Now, where it was coming out of was a doorway in the opposite direction of it, like a little room with one door on one side, one door on the other, and it made like a horseshoe through her house through the back bedrooms where my uncle was at. So, being sarcastic, I got up, and the door that was opened is where the shadow came from, and it was going toward the door that was closed. So I opened that door, and I said, "If you want to go through, then go ahead." I opened the door and went and sat down, and whenever I sat down, that's whenever I seen its head and face. The best way I can describe it is it was an older man, it was a shadow, but it was like a 3D shadow. It was so real looking. And it went across the hallway. After that happened, the next night my cousin had came to our house. He had what looked like baby handprints that had maybe slapped him, it looked like, all night. And they ended up getting a preacher that came and blessed the house and everything. After that, it had all stopped. That was what led me to find God, because I knew that if there was a demon, then there had to be a God. So, then we lived in a brick home that we lived in when I was younger, and I stayed in the first bedroom on the left-hand side of this home. And I would tell my mom that I did not like this room. And in the room, there was a small closet, and it was an old-time hospital bed in that room that I was sleeping in. It had the old cranks at the end where your feet were at. One crank would raise your head, the other one would raise your feet. I was laying in there one night, and I would see things crawling in the floor. And it was kind of like, they weren't large, but they looked like a bunch of kids crawling in the floor. Of course, I'd tell my mom and dad, and they wouldn't believe me. They would send me back to bed, and they would tell me, go back to bed. There ain't nothing in there. And it was terrifying. Well, I had lost my tooth, and being younger and everything, I still believed in the tooth fairy. So I put my tooth into my pillow that night, and I was laying there. And my closet door opens, and the light comes on. And a lady in a red dress comes walking out of the closet lifts my head, actually lifted my head, laid my head back down, walked back into the closet, and turned out the light. The next morning I woke up, and when I looked under my pillow to find my tooth, or the money for my tooth, there was my tooth. So I had told my mom about it, and she laughed. They always laughed it off. Later on, we had moved from that house, and my dad was a carpenter. He built houses, and we was building a house, and the guy we was building a house for, he was living in that brick house that we lived in, and somehow or another, we had all got to talking, and he told my dad, he said, yeah, my daughter won't stay in that first room right there. He goes, she says there's a lady in there that bothers her in a red dress. And I just kind of looked at my dad, and my dad looked at me, and I said, I told you so, And that's why I always say, believe what your kids are telling you, because they may be telling you the truth. We had another incident. Where I lived is by a place to where a lot of cultism is practiced. And there's a place down there that they do it a lot. Me and my cousin would walk up and down this country road, and while we would walk, and there was two older men in it, and they told us to get in the van. And, we'd been told never get in a van with a stranger and everything, but we were a little afraid too, because it was two adults, and they were being demanding and almost made you want to listen to them, because you were taught to listen to adults. And luckily, behind us, at the gate, there was an old gate that went into a cow pasture. And there was, just bales of hay in there, and this big old cowboy comes walking out, and we were like, thank God, And he yells at those guys to get on out of there and leave us alone. And I mean, this guy was like big. And, of course, they sped out of there. And when we turned around, that guy was gone. And we always said that was our guardian angel. Also, I worked security at a mall. And there was nights that I would have to work inside of this mall all night long. Whenever everybody would leave the mall, you could hear it sound like doors closing. You could hear what sounded like kids laughing. You could hear, people talking. But you knew there was no way it could be, because whenever everybody would leave at night, we would arm the motion detectors inside of the mall. That way that we would know if somebody was in any part of the mall. Well, on the east wing of the mall, a man had actually took his life. And we would hear things down there a lot. One night, whenever I was leaving the mall, it was a dark night, and I was walking down the corridor, and just as I walked past the restrooms, the toilet flushed. And I turned around, went back, looked in the bathroom, and of course there was nothing in there. And whenever I went and armed the main alarm for the mall to go out, and then to shut the door to arm the whole mall, just as I went to shut the door, something inside said goodbye. So I went and I told my boss about it. And he told me, he said, that's happened before to a lot of the other officers. And they had a recording that they showed me. One officer had ran completely out of the mall after saying, he said he looked into Sears, is where he said he looked. And he seen the whole, the old Civil War, which he said was happening in front of him. And he left, and he had never returned because of what he, said he had seen. Now, probably one of the most scariest places that I'd ever lived, me and my wife had bought a mobile home in a trailer park. I was working nights. I was a new officer then, and they always usually rotate you on night times when you first start out. And my wife got to the point to where she would not stay at the house at night because she said she would hear screaming inside of the house. I thought she was probably just afraid or, didn't want to be home by herself at night. And eventually things started getting even worse. Started noticing the teddy bears in the back bedroom. When we would wake up in the mornings, they would be in the front room. every morning we would get up, they would be like different places in the front room. And we never could figure out, how they was getting in there because at this time we didn't have no kids. So something had to be moving them during the night while we were asleep. And I had a picture in the front room. My dad had actually made a frame for me, and it's a picture of Jesus with the cherubs around him. And I was telling an officer about it that I worked with because this picture is actually the whole New Testament. So if you get like a magnifying glass and look at this large picture, you can read the Bible in it. And anyways, he told me, he said, "Oh, I would love to see that." So one day on my way out the door, I snapped a quick photo of it. And I went to work, and he was there, and I said, "Hey, here's that picture you want to see." And I slid it across the counter to him on my phone, and I hadn't looked at it. I knew that I took a picture of it. And he said, "Please don't ever show me that again." And I said, "What do you mean? That's the picture that you wanted to see." And he said, "No, I didn't want to see that." And I said, "What do you mean?" And I took it, and whenever I looked at the picture, there was like an old white-haired man in the picture. You could kind of see, through him, but you could see the detail of this guy. He had a white beard. It was really like manicured, very well manicured. Looked like a regular man. He didn't look like a monster or anything, but he looked like he was angry, maybe upset. And we couldn't figure out, why would this, be in the picture. So anyways, as time went on, we would still have the teddy bears would be moved from the bedroom. We would hear like knocks or walking in the back part of the house. It was never in the bedroom we were staying in, but always the bedroom on the back side of the house. And my wife collected teddy bears. It was really bothering her a lot. She got to where she wouldn't even stay home if I left. And there was one day that they called me and they asked me if I would like to work a day shift. And I said, yeah, I would work a day shift. And she said, okay, well, since it's going to be daytime, I'll just stay home. I was working, and noontime had came around, and I called her at noon to check on her to see if she was okay. And there was no answer. So I was sitting there, and I was talking to my sergeant at the time, and I made another phone call, and she didn't answer. And I guess he saw the concern on my face, and he said, is everything okay? I said, well, I'm calling my wife, and she's not answering. And he's like, well, why don't you just go on down there and, check out where she's at, because she was in our patrol district, and we wouldn't be leaving our area. And he said, go check on her. So I drive all the way over, and whenever I get up to the front door, I can smell natural gas really, really strong. So I went in through the door, and she's laying on the couch, and I couldn't hardly get her to wake. I had to help her out of the door. Something had turned our gas stove on in the kitchen and was gassing her. And we had to call the fire department, and they came in and they said, well, the stove was turned on. All the burners were turned on the stove. That was really bothering us. So we were a younger couple, so we went to the man that ran the trailer park, and we started kind of inquiring about who lived there before us and everything. And he was telling us it was an older couple, and that they had slept in the back bedroom where she kept the teddy bears. And we thought, that's odd. Well, he's telling us all that. And then he tells us that they both died in a natural gas leak. So we got to thinking, maybe there's something in this trailer that's, that's evil. And it just, things kept happening and happening inside of that trailer. And then eventually we got a dog. And this is the part that was probably the weirdest. The dog was like a shepherd, beautiful shepherd dog. And we would just leave him running in the house, and we would go to our bedroom at night when we would go to sleep, and we would shut the door. One night, I got up to go to the restroom, and I was going to get me a drink in the kitchen. Well, you would walk down the hallway, and then it would open up into the kitchen, and then you would have a bar in front of you. And then through the bar, you could see into the front room, back to the other bedroom where it was located at the other end of the house. So I'm walking down the hallway, and whenever I looked through, I actually thought I saw somebody walking in there, and it freaked me out at first, and I thought, who in the heck? But then I noticed it wasn't somebody. I noticed that what I was seeing was the dog walking on its hind legs around in the front room. And I thought, what in the world is that dog? Because it freaked me out, you know. So I went back and I got my wife and I was like, hey, come here and look at this. So she comes down the hallway and she witnesses this dog walking on its hind legs around in our front room. But whenever we walk into the kitchen, and the floor was like the central air and heat grate that's there, and whenever we stepped on it, it kind of like made that metal noise, it creaked or whatever. The dog heard us, and whenever it looked at us, it dropped to all fours just like it was a normal dog. Well, this dog got to where at nighttime, we would hear it in the hallway, and you could hear it walking, and it sounded like it was on two legs, and it just really started bothering us, started bothering her. So our neighbors, they had always liked the dog and was wanting the dog, and they kept asking us for the dog, so we gave them the dog. And it might have been a week later or something, maybe like on the weekend whenever I was off work, and he caught me outside and he was like, hey, we had to get rid of that dog. And I was like, oh, really? And he's like, yeah. He said, my dad came over and he said that dog was possessed because it was walking around in our house at night on its hind legs. And I was like, really? And I never told him that we'd seen it doing that at our house, but he said they actually took the dog and his dad had got rid of the dog. What they done with it, I don't know what they done, but he said they had to get rid of it. It was really, really, really freaky to him. Then there was a time that we moved a trailer out here, actually where I live now. And the gentleman that lived where we live right now, he was my actual janitor at the school I went to. He always wore a big cowboy hat. He was a really friendly man, and he was a cowboy. And of course, we live in the country, and just a really polite man. He had a Callahooly dog, and when we would see him at school and talk to him, he was always really friendly. And he had found out that he had a terminal disease, and he took his life on this property. Now, when he took his life, you know, I'm in my 40s, so it was a while back. I was in elementary. Well, my mom and them, we had bought this property, and I moved a mobile home on the property and started living there with my kids and my wife. And my son comes running down, you know, out of the hallway, and he says, Dad, there's a man in the hallway. And I thought because we had not lived in the country that maybe they had got scared, because out here it is very dark and it's very quiet. So I got up and I went to check the hallway. Of course, there was nothing in the hallway. Well, then both of my sons on another night, they come running down the hallway and they're both saying the same thing. There's a man in the hallway and he's pointing his finger like to get out of the hallway, and they said he had a dog. So I asked them, I'm like, what does this dog look like? Well, they start telling me it's just a little dog. He's not real big. He's kind of medium sized, you know. But the man, they said, had a cowboy hat. And I had never told them about this guy, and there's no way they could have ever known. But they described the janitor at my school that had took his life. And there was no way they could have known that. No way. So we had the house blessed, and we haven't had any trouble since then. Now, at my granny's house, where we had a lot of paranormal activity, we would sit there, and you would hear in the kitchen what would sound like a bag of beans open, or maybe a bag of rice, or something like that. And it would sound like it would pour all over the kitchen floor. I mean, just like you had a huge mess in there. You would go in there, there wouldn't be nothing in there. It just clean. The floor would be clean. You could never find anything in there. But there was a man, and my uncles and my cousin at the time, there was a man that actually floated through the pasture one evening, and they had actually shot at this thing several times. And it looked like a white-haired man wearing a white T-shirt, and you could only see the shirt where it went down to where the grass was tall, and you could tell that it wasn't moving normally. It was more like it was floating, or kind of like, you know, floating through the grass instead of walking through the grass. And, we always couldn't never figure, what is that? And they had a dog. And this dog one day, it comes running up out of the field and it's carrying something in its mouth. And it would run a little ways and it would drop whatever it was carrying. And then it would run a little ways and then it would drop it. And then kept doing that all the way up to the propane tank. And it drops whatever it was carrying and it just catches on fire. It caught the grass on fire by the propane tank and caught the fence line on fire and everything. And we ended up having a pretty big fire and happened to put that out. We never knew actually what caused that to happen, but we knew that it was very, very, very weird for that to happen. Now I'm more afraid of paranormal things than I am most things, and that's probably because I think that they can become attached to things. My uncle had bought my cousin a bunch of toys one year for Christmas, and for some reason or another, he had went to the dump that was down the road, and he found it was kind of like a GI Joe teddy bear, like a big figurine. And I remember he had brought it back, and he had also had given that to him. And now my cousin was in his bedroom, and he was always telling me that this thing was moving on his dresser, and it would move around, and it was really scaring him. And so he asked me to stay all night with him. I had went to his house, and I was staying all night, and I had to go to the restroom. Well, whenever I went to go to the restroom, they had a long hallway that looked into their bathroom. And whenever I walked to the hallway and looked down the hallway, there was an actual man standing in the hallway and scared me really bad. I went into the front room and I'd actually woke my aunt. And my aunt got up and she was used to kind of this stuff happening. And she's trying to calm me. She's got the kitchen light on and I'm really upset and everything. And we're sitting there and I'm like, that was really weird because it wasn't like I saw a shadow. There was a man standing in the bathroom. And she was talking to me about it, telling me, it ain't nothing that's going to hurt you, And while we're sitting there, my uncle had passed away. They had a glass of water sitting there I was drinking and a glass of water that she was drinking. And the empty chair where my uncle sat, I had set my glass of water there whenever I had walked over to the sink. Whenever I started walking back over to where she was at, the chair where my uncle would sit, it actually creaked and kind of moved sideways. It didn't move backwards. It kind of like pulled out sideways, and the glass of water actually slid across the table like somebody had sat down and slid the water away from the table where they would sit. I actually got really sick to my stomach that night and ended up having to call my mom to come pick me up because it was more than what I was able really to handle. Whenever you're young and you walk in there and you see things that's, not supposed to be there. I remember laying in my bedroom in that old brick house and just seeing the things crawl on the floor and you could hear like whispering. It was terrifying to me because, you didn't know what it was. And at the time, I didn't know a whole lot about, the paranormal world or anything. I just knew that there was something in my floor that was crawling around that shouldn't have been there crawling around. Probably one of my favorite stories. This one's kind of personal, but my granny was, she was in bed one night and she had had a stroke and, they wasn't expecting her to pass away this night or anything. And I was down visiting her and I was sitting beside her in the bed and, she was talking to me. And of course, her daughters that would take turns taking care of her, they were there, but they were in the front room. And she was like a second mom to me. She had took care of me most of my life. And she told me that Grandpa was there and he was going to be leaving. And I told her, I said, Granny, you're not going nowhere, And we was sitting there and it's like she didn't really laugh. She was not mad, but she was serious. And she held my hand with both of her hands. And she told me, she said, go in there on the headboard where me and Grandpa used to sleep, and I want you to get the old .32 pistol. Well, this 32 pistol had been in the family forever. It's an old 32 pistol, and we always knew we were safe when Granny and Grandpa had that pistol. It was just we had a lot of faith in it, and faith in being safe when they had it. And she said, "I want you to have that." And I told her, I said, "Well, I'll get it someday, Granny. Not tonight." She said, "No, I want you to have that." So I had it, and I was sitting there talking to her, and she looked over at the corner, and she said, "Grandpa's here." And I said, "Grandpa's not here, Granny." And she goes, "Yeah, he's over there. He's wearing his coveralls. He looks really good. He's happy. He's smiling, and he's come to get me." And I mean, she's not acting, lucid. She's not on medications to do that. She's just like talking, just like any other night. And it wasn't long, and she like let go of my hand, and she reached toward the corner of the room, and she looked right at me, and she said, "I love you." And I said, "Well, yeah, I love you too." And she hit her head back, and she passed away. And I always felt that Grandpa had come to get her. And that just goes to show that there is things out there that we don't see every day. And it gave me proof that it's there, because if it wasn't there, then she wouldn't have seen it. I mean, she wasn't a person to ever lie to. But that's pretty much all my paranormal experiences that I've had. But they was a large impact on my life. And I learned that the things they say aren't out there are out there, because I seen them myself. And when you see something that you don't understand, and it's so perfectly clear to you that the shadow that passed in the hallway wasn't just a shadow, but you could tell it was an old man with his hair parted, a 3D, just perfect shadow, that don't just happen.
If you've had a paranormal experience and would like to be a guest on the show, please contact us by going to myparax.com. That's myparaex.com. Thanks for listening.